Hey everyone, it's Travis, the Pagan Scholar, here with Chapter 3 of Chas Clifton's Her Hidden Children, The Rhetoric of Wicca. Ultimately, this is a linguistic investigation of three terms that Clifton thinks are specifically important to the study of contemporary paganism. Can you guess the first one? I bet you can. It's paganism. Alongside that, we also have the terms witch and Wicca. Now, before you get excited, I understand not everybody who is pagan is a witch, not everybody who is a witch is Wiccan, and not everybody who is Wiccan is anything else. But these are three very specific and important words that we use in our discourse of religion that get tossed around a lot. The very first instance that we have of an intellectual or of a figure of authority taking notice and trying to reinvent these terms that pagans use a lot is actually Margaret Murray. I am not a fan of Margaret Murray, but that's just me. There's a lot of murky things surrounding her research. She was an Egyptologist and a amateur or backyard folklorist, and during the war, since she couldn't study in Egypt, she decided to turn her attention to the indigenous practices of European religions, and she came up with the hypothesis of the witch cult. In 1929, she was selected by Encyclopedia Britannica to pen the entry for witchcraft. Margaret Murray popularized the notion that witchcraft was an old religion, that it was a Stone Age tradition that predated Christianity, and that it was not the magical or the wicked witches that were so popular in fiction. However, with pagan, we have a kind of different story because we're drawing from ancient historical documents that talk about the etymology of pagan, and we're also talking about super contemporary, at least by that time frame perspective, of Hans Holzer, who was writing in the 70s. So let's talk about the term pagan. There was no pagan in pre-Christian or in the emerging Christian demographic of like ancient Greece or in the old world. You had mystery cults, you had mystery religions, you had the cult of Bacchus, you had the cult of Isis, you have all these different cults also mean something different, but we're not going to get into that. Hans Holzer, writing for The Green Egg, which was a publication by the Church of All Worlds, we'll get to that in a future video, described the pagan idea, the term, or to define pagan, as simply, a person who loved country air. But he also did draw from the historical idea that pagan came from the Roman equivalent of a country cousin. Paganus, actually, in the 4th century Common Era, it's the first time that we see it in writing, and Paganus means a county district or a locale. It's somebody who did live in, who was not an urbanite. Yet, this usage of pagan never occurs in the Bible, in the Latin translations anyways. Paganus was kind of a slang term for Christians, meaning those who were civilians. And, to take that one step further, those who were not baptized in the army of Christ. So thus we have the idea of a pagan being a country dweller, being a person who is not in the urbanite select, and who is a civilian who is not part of the Christian army. It's kind of difficult to tell where ideology and definition start to blur and merge, but this is what we've got for pagan so far. Another figure to popularize the term pagan was Tim Zell. He was the spokesperson for the Church of All Worlds, and he would make very broad, sweeping, sometimes historically inaccurate claims about the word pagan and what it meant to be pagan. Claims like fairies were an indigenous race of Great Britain and they were driven out by the Anglo-Saxons. That 9 million pagans were persecuted during the burning times. That is a shit ton of people. Do you understand how gross a number that is? 9 million people? And a bunch of other stuff that we're not going to get into because we're talking about words. We're not talking about facts per se. Also, real quick, what could have been, paganism actually kind of shouldered aside another term that was vying for, popularity, and that was Aquarian. Yes, we could have all been Aquarians. The age of Aquarius. Anyways, no, but yeah, I just thought that was kind of interesting how it was just, selecting the word that sounded better. Anyways, so yeah, we are pagan, we are not Aquarian. On to the next word. Witch. This is a very controversial word. within, without, inside, around, everywhere, everybody's got their own definition of the word witch. This is going to be an unpopular segment in my videos, I know it. In fact, I actually called upon a friend of mine who studies linguistics. He is a teaching fellow at a nearby university, and I haven't heard back from him yet. I mean, he has said that he would help me out, but I think I might make a separate video of that altogether and just discuss the etymology of the word witch. However, we can talk about Clifton's etymology and observations of the word witch as it occurs within his book. First off, we turn to, again, Margaret Murray, who in the 1929 Encyclopedia Britannica updated the term witchcraft. Previous to Margaret Murray, we do have Jules Michelet, which I talked about in one of the Triumph of the Moon videos, who kind of tried to reclaim the idea of a witch as this feminist term and kind of failed horribly. And also Charles Leland, the author of Aradia, The Gospel of the Witches. I have mixed feelings about that text as well, but that's for another video. However, we can say that those two did use the term witch and witchcraft in their writings and did try to interpret it and find a way to understand it. Reading through the chapter, I have noticed that there's kind of 4 different interpretations or causes of using the word witch before we get to the actual etymological definition. So we've got the Margaret Murray assumption that witch comes from the word wit, meaning wise. And following Margaret Murray, we've got Gerald Gardner, who borrows from Margaret Murray, but he rides 2 horses at once, to quote the book, and proclaims that a witch is anybody who follows the old religion and anybody who is a magical worker. I mean, or, and / or. Anyway, but we also have this kind of shifting zeitgeist, this idea that pagans are starting to understand that witch is a very loaded word, and it's kind of difficult to say if pagans actually want to be called witches or not, if they practice witchcraft. Margot Adler, or Margot, whatever, notes that some people decided to reclaim the word witch, much like lesbians reclaimed the word dyke in the LGBT communities. However, not all witches wanted to be called witches. Not all... See, this is hard. Anyways, not all contemporary pagans who practice witchcraft decided that they wanted to be called witches. There we go. To further complicate things, in the 70s, we have the rise of satanic witchcraft. And pagans did not want to be associated with Satanists. And even then, you can split hairs and talk about the different sects of Satanism, the House of Set versus Anton LaVey. Anyways, getting way, way off track. So we've got Margaret Murray, we've got Gerald Gardner, we've got the Margot Adler interpretation that some wanted witchcraft, some didn't want witchcraft, and then we have satanic witches. And thus we arrive at the idea of the cold hard facts that witchcraft doesn't have any actual etymological meaning other than witchcraft. I really like this research, so I'm just going to read to you what I have found. The etymology of the word witch is vague. The American Heritage Dictionary, a woman who practices sorcery or is believed to have dealings with the devil, derives from the Proto-Indo-European root wick, a word connected with magic and religious notions, and related to guile, wile, and victim, in the sense of a sacrificial animal. Wit and wise are shown as having a different root, which linguist Mario Pai derives from the Proto-Indo-European root wedi, to see, and which underlies the Sanskrit veda, the Greek idea, such Latin-derived words as video, envy, and survey, and the Germanic wizard, wise, and even twit, probably shortened from nitwit, not wise. Further, actually, I'm going to keep reading. The Oxford English Dictionary suggests that the masculine form Wicca, pronounced witcha, and the feminine witch could have derived from the verb wicken, to bewitch, but that leaves us more or less where we were. So, linguistically, when we're talking about what witch means, it means a witch. He goes on to state that there are a lot of proposed ideas that the root word means to bend or wise. However, that's like saying there and there and there all mean the same thing. but they don't. Just because they sound the same does not mean that etymologically they came from the same thing. They actually have different roots in different words. Okay, now that you all hate me, let's talk about the term Wicca, so you can hate me some more. We do know that it is the Old English masculine noun of witch. 1,000 years ago, it was pronounced witcha. However, contemporary usage and the popularization of Gerald Gardner's writings, we have started to call it Wicca. We've dropped that t. Anyways, hard C's. But we still have to ask, where did the word Wicca come from? It does not show up in Margaret Murray's writings, and the first time that we see it is actually in Gerald Gardner's work, Witchcraft Today, published in 1954. However, Gardner claims that he was inducted into the New Forest Coven in 1939, and that's where he learned witchcraft and Wicca. In 1949, he wrote the novel High Magic's Aid, but even though there are lots of Wiccan themes, he never uses the word Wicca in the book. So timeline, 1939, Gerald Gardner is initiated into the New Forest Coven. 1949, Gerald Gardner writes High Magic's Aid, a fictional account of Wicca, but never uses the actual term. 1954, Wicca is a term that is used in his text, Witchcraft Today. This is academically suspect. If Gardner is telling the truth when he says that he was taught a Stone Age pre-Christian religion by the New Forest Haven, and that they taught him the term Wicca, why did he not use it until 20 years later? Granted, maybe he was respecting the identities of the New Forest Coven. That is totally plausible. Some scholars think that maybe it was made up, and other scholars believe that it was reconstructed. This is kind of where we get to start playing with words and investigating how we invest meaning and attention and definitions in the words that we use to describe our spirituality. We have a spirituality that people can learn about, that we have defined terms, that we can explain ourselves, and we have some kind of difficult historical and linguistic backgrounds that we need to deal with. However, whenever we use the term Wicca today, we understand what it means, which means it's a word that it's functioning within a language, and that we can communicate with one another what Wicca means. So ultimately, whether Gardner made up the term, whether he made up the religion wholesale, or whether he reconstructed and borrowed themes from different elements of a religion, that's up to you. That is up to you to invest a meaning into the word. That was almost gone. That was almost lost, but I brought it back. So don't hate me too much. You can only hate me 99%. You can't hate me 100%, because I am actually kind of being an apologist for Wicca right now. An unlikely hero, or maybe not a hero, but an unlikely defendant of Wicca being a craft of the wise, is actually Ronald Hutton. He actually cites Chambers' Scots English Dictionary as defining Wicca, spelt with one C, which is how Gerald Gardner spelt it, as meaning wise. Throw that in there at the very end of the chapter, after you've, defiled the entire, believed etymology of Wicca, after you've said it's all bullshit. Oh wait, here's some actual proof. So, yeah, it's kind of difficult. That means that we really do have to do the work ourselves, that we do have to invest meaning into the words. However, Clifton is not setting out to do a linguistic or philosophical work. He's doing a historical work. By the 70s, Wicca had sort of surpassed a lot of other terms because it was neutral. It wasn't loaded like witch, and it wasn't obscure and kind of hard to pin down like pagan. Wicca became a very comfortable term for pagans to use to express themselves and to be mistaken by. As Wicca started to gain in popularity and notoriety, a lot of people assumed that if you were pagan, you were Wiccan. And thus we have so many YouTube videos of the difference between Wiccan and pagan. However, if we are going to be talking about terms, we also have to talk about the popularity of terms and how they rise into our vernacular. A term can mean anything at all, but if it's not used, or if it's not used in the proper way, then who gives a shit about its etymological history? Thus we have the next chapter, The Playboy and the Witch. Witchcraft in popular culture. That will be next week, I think. I'm gonna try and actually shoot that video early ahead of time because I'm out of town for St. Patrick's Day. Not for St. Patrick's Day, but incidentally. Maybe I'll make a video about that, about why I do not celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Regardless, A like is appreciated, a subscription even more so, and as always, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again.